Hello everyone, this is Shelby Moore, and this is going to be video 2 of 4 for chapter 1 of micro and macroeconomics. In the first video for this chapter, we talked about the five foundations of economics, keeping in mind that economists are going to use these 5 principles to think of every issue. And those 5 principles are incentives, trade-offs, opportunity cost, marginal thinking, and that trade creates value. In this particular video, we're going to cover incentives and trade-offs, and you'll want to keep this list in mind throughout the entire course because it's going to provide you with a basic framework of how to look at the world through the lens of economics. First up, we want to talk about incentives. So keep in mind that for economists to study people and how people behave, we want to know what makes people make decisions. And in this case, incentives matter. Incentives are factors that motivate you to act or to exert effort, and they affect how people respond. A great example of this is getting paid to do a job. Obviously, you're a lot more likely to go to work and to get things done if you're going to get paid to do so. If I were talking about attending an in-person course and the expectation was that you were to attend the course every single meeting, things like attendance policies, extra credit possibilities, and participation points would be a really good example of various incentives to get you to exert that effort to attend the class. Something important to keep in mind, incentives are not always positive. We break incentives down into being positive or negative. Positive incentives are going to encourage an action by offering reward or payment. So these can be things like bonuses, gifts, an allowance, or treats. So we even use incentives on our pets, or they can be negative incentives. These are meant to discourage an action by providing some type of undesirable consequence or punishment. These can be things like grounding, the loss of a toy, paying a fine for speeding or for breaking a law, going to jail, or losing your job. Both positive and negative incentives are very useful, and sometimes they're necessary in changing people's behavior. Keep in mind that while we have positive and negative incentives, we can also break those down into the direct and indirect category. Direct incentives are when we're very straightforward about what we want. We tell people exactly what we want them to do and how we're going to get them to do it, and they're very easy to recognize. So these are things like if your sales this month are over your sales quota, you'll get a bonus. Don't get any tickets or have any accidents, and we'll reduce your car insurance premiums. If you do yard work, I'll give you $40, or if you get straight A's, I'll give you $500. These are all very direct incentives and very easy to recognize. Indirect incentives are a little bit trickier. These are secondary changes in behavior that are brought on by the original incentive. They're a little bit harder to recognize because they're not always intentional. Some examples of indirect incentives are maybe to reach the sales quota, that salesperson pushes too hard with some clients, or they don't spend any time with their family that month. If somebody knows that they'll get a reduced premium by not having any tickets or accidents, they might not report a small fender bender to the police to avoid the insurance company knowing. If you offer to give your child $40 for doing yard work, they may then require payment for doing anything around the house going forward. All of these are indirect incentives, and they're that secondary change that occurs because of that original incentive. On the next slide, we'll talk all about unintended consequences, which is really what our direct incentives break down to be. So unintended consequences are just unplanned results, which are typically negative and unwanted of an incentive. Anytime that government policymakers are trying to come up with new policy, they have to figure out how they can balance benefits that are brought on by this policy with the potential unintended consequences of that same policy. So a really good example is to look at welfare or unemployment. The intended effect of welfare programs are to alleviate suffering from poverty and to make sure that children have enough food to eat and a nice place to live. Now, while these are the intended effects of these programs, an unintended effect may be that people choose not to work. This obviously isn't the case with the majority of people, and it's not going to be the case a lot of times, but there may be higher unemployment that's caused by the government plan to provide higher unemployment compensation. Now, keep in mind that not just with government policy, but with every policy in general, this is a big problem. Policymakers really have to take into consideration how can we provide a safety net or implement a policy, but also try to navigate and prevent these unintended consequences. Before we move into trade-offs, I want to give you another practice what you know question. Remember, these are pretty helpful when it comes to studying for your exams, and they're also just going to help you quickly retain and remember the information that we cover in these videos. So first up, for this question, which of the following situation illustrates an incentive? We have Dave snacks all afternoon and isn't hungry for dinner. Dirk's children misbehave during dinner. Lee gives candy to his children if they behave during dinner. And Jamie goes out to a restaurant for dinner. In this case, the correct answer is choice C. Lee gives his children candy if they behave during dinner. Remember, an incentive is a motivator to get someone to change his or her behavior. And in this case, the children are provided with a positive incentive to behave during the meal. Next up, we want to talk about trade-offs. So because we have scarce resources, people have to choose some things over others. Doing one thing will often mean that you don't have the time, resources, or energy to do something else. And every single decision is going to incur a cost. As a student, this is something that you deal with constantly. You have to make decisions on what you're going to do with your time, and there's always going to be a trade-off for those decisions. If you choose to go to class or to sit and listen to these lecture videos, there's going to be some type of trade-off, whether that's giving up time with your family, giving up time with your friends, giving up time that you could potentially be working. Every single decision that you make will have that trade-off. If we choose to spend $10 on a pizza, we're not going to have that same $10 to spend on something else. And this really applies in the big picture the same way to the government, because they have to decide how they're going to spend tax dollars. Will it be in education or healthcare? Will it be roads or defense? So there's always going to be that trade-off. When we pick one thing, there's always going to be something else that we're giving up. Before we end this video, I want to provide you with one more practice what you know question. So in this case, the question says, the governor decides to increase funding for education. However, this will mean decreasing funding for infrastructure. This particular situation illustrates what? So we have trade-offs, comparative advantage, incentives, or markets. And in this case, this is going to illustrate a trade-off. It also illustrates scarcity, choice, and opportunity cost, which we will cover opportunity cost and marginal thinking in the next video for this chapter. If you have any questions about what we covered in this video, please feel free to reach out. And if you're feeling pretty confident with this information, please do head back over to Blackboard and click on video 3 for chapter 1. Thank you.